What kind of sword might Santa Claus use? Well, the first thing to say is that most people's idea of Santa Claus is obviously something that's evolved over time. This, I understand, is a very silly video to be making, but nevertheless it's a bit of fun, and actually we can squeeze a little bit of history in there. So the first thing to say is that you have Saint Nicholas and you have Father Christmas, and these are two different, I won't say people, because Father Christmas, as far as we know, never existed. Oh. Okay, I'm really sorry if I let anything out of the bag there for any of my viewers, but so there's Father Christmas and there's Saint Nicholas, and they are two separate things. Saint Nicholas was definitely a real person. Saint Nicholas was a 4th century Greek priest, and he was known for his philanthropy and generosity and giving things to children, and quite fundamentally, he almost certainly never would have had a sword, because he was a priest and because he didn't have any reason to have a sword. However, in theory, he could have had a sword. He could have owned a sword. He could have gone and bought a sword. So in the 300s, which is the 4th century, a Greek priest could indeed have purchased a sword, and it probably would have been something equivalent to a Roman Sparta, which is like a longer version of a gladius, essentially. So that's the type of sword that Saint Nicholas could have owned. But let's switch over to Father Christmas. Well, if Father Christmas was a real, he wasn't just a mythological character, but he was actually a real person who presumably is still alive and had been alive since ancient times, theoretically we could just say that he could have owned any swords that were around in the period of history that he existed in. And for anyone who's read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, of course, we know that he gives Peter a sword in the land of Narnia. So that Father Christmas, the mythological British personage who existed throughout time, could have had access to any swords. That means if he'd been around in the Roman period, it would have been Gladii and Spartae. If he'd been around in the migration period, it would have been those types of Germanic swords that were around then, the Viking era, Viking sort of period swords, right the way through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance and so on and so forth. And in fact, period artwork does in fact occasionally show Father Christmas with swords, either with swords as gifts or swords in the background, or indeed sometimes him with a sword. And those swords can be of any type, because of course Father Christmas is a fantasy character, so he could have the sword of the historical period that he's being featured in, or indeed the fantasy world that he's being featured in, or indeed he could have any sword whatsoever, because clearly if he's being featured in the 19th century, he could have a medieval sword that was his sword from hundreds of years earlier. So theoretically he could be featured with any type of sword. And we also have to say he is British. Okay, so Father Christmas, as far as we can tell, is a British character. That's not to say that he didn't exist in other cultures, but the Father Christmas that's come down to us is British. I'm sorry to break it to you, Father Christmas is British, okay, and so therefore he would have used probably particularly British types of sword. As far as we can tell, the earliest documented instances of Father Christmas as a character seems to be from the time of Henry VIII, so the Tudor period, and in that period there were a number of different types of sword available to him. He could have been using a certain type of side sword, or perhaps early forms of rapier, although the side sword and the rapier, where do you draw the line between one and the other? It could indeed, if he was British and he wanted to use an iconic British type of sword of this period, he could have been using a basket-hilted sword, that is either a two-edged or a one-edged, so a broadsword or a backsword, but with a British basket hilt on it, like the one found on the Mary Rose. And in fact, I think that would suit him rather well. So he could be a Henry VIII period British Father Christmas wearing a basket hilted sword. Or indeed from this period, he could be using a large two-handed sword. One of Henry VIII's armours is often shown with a large two-handed sword of an English type. So he could be holding that, for example. Let's just go full fantasy. Let's assume that he is a real character who flies around on a sledge pulled by flying reindeers. Why the hell not? We're making this video, so let's go full in. let's assume that he flies around essentially on a chariot, so it's an aerial chariot. What type of sword would make sense in that scenario? Well, first of all, we have to say that a sword isn't the primary weapon, okay? In most periods of history, the sword is a sidearm. It's something you wear. It's something you can conveniently carry like a large knife. But it's not usually, or not very often, a primary weapon, as I mentioned in many of my videos. So if he was on an aerial chariot, probably his primary weapon would have to be a bow or a crossbow or a gun, because ranged weapons are what make the most sense from this type of mobile fighting platform. Secondarily to that, you need something with reach. So even if you're in hand-to-hand combat, you can't reach very far from a flying chariot. So something like a lance or a spear or some other type of pole weapon. But given that he's traveling at high speed, I would perhaps something that cuts, like a glaive or a naginata, something like this. That might work. So I would say a piercing or a cutting weapon that's got long reach. So we're looking at bows and other missile weapons and pole weapons as his primary weapons. But if he did have a sword, it would have to be something with long reach, and I would suggest with hand protection if he had a choice. So perhaps a long cavalry palash or a long sabre, or perhaps an estoc, conserves, this type of weapon. Or indeed a large two-handed sword, because of course if he's standing aboard his chariot and he's got good balance and he doesn't need to hold reins or something like this, he could use a two-handed sword. Although I think, generally speaking, if you're flying around and it's tossing you and turning you all over the place, you want to be holding reins with your left hand, just in case you suddenly get jerked off to the right or jerked off to the left. So holding some reins or some other thing with your left hand. You could wear a shield on your left arm, and then you'd have one hand free. In that case, I think we're back to the basket hilt. I think a basket hilted sword, perhaps a sabre, or any other type of relatively long-bladed one-handed sword would be what he'd pick. So there we go. Historically, St. Nicholas, I think, would have no sword, but he could have chosen a sword of 4th century Greece or, you know, late Roman Empire. Whereas Father Christmas has a whole host of swords to choose from. Fantasy, historical, real, made up, whatever. And I think, depending on the context, depending how he's fighting, perhaps when he's fighting on foot, he'd have a large two-hander that he keeps in the back of his sledge underneath all the presents for the kids. But perhaps when he's fighting from his chariot and flying through the air, he's holding the reins with a large shield to protect himself from enemy missile weapons and using a long one-handed sword with superior reach. Anyway, I hope that gives you something to think about. Merry Christmas. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.